In 1888, the emperor tasked with commanding the most powerful army in Europe was a mute. This was none other than Frederick III of the German Empire. Ascending the throne with terminal throat cancer, he could only breathe with difficulty through a cold silver tube inserted into his throat. Instead of commanding his empire with a voice, he had to issue orders with pen and paper. He was granted only 99 days. As soon as this short line of defense collapsed, disaster struck. His son, Wilhelm II, seized power before his father's body was even cold, immediately beginning a reckless rampage that eventually destroyed the German Empire and pushed the entire world into the First World War. We will track the 99 days of the 20th century's worst butterfly effect, how the death of one emperor led to the fall of an empire and the destruction of the world. But to really understand how this nightmare unfolded, we have to leave the deathbed of 1888. The seeds of this disaster weren't planted in a hospital room, but in the freezing, polished corridors of the Prussian court decades earlier. Frederick William, Fritz to his family, was born in October 1831 at the New Palace in Potsdam. From his very first breath, he was a pawn in a brutal domestic war that would determine the future of Europe. He was a Hohenzollern, the dynasty that had forged Prussia from the sandy soil of Brandenburg, using discipline, bureaucracy, and the bayonet. But his blood was a volatile mix of two opposing worldviews. His father was Prince Wilhelm, the man who would become the first German emperor. Wilhelm was a soldier's soldier, stiff, conservative, and completely unimaginative. To him, a king was a commander-in-chief first and a ruler second. He believed in the divine right of kings and looked at parliaments as nothing more than noisy, useless clubs for lawyers. His mother, however, was Augusta of Saxe-Weimar. She was the intellectual heavyweight of the marriage, a liberal and a Francophile who read Goethe and Voltaire. She despised the boorish militarism of the Prussian court. She hated her husband's narrow-mindedness, and she wasn't afraid to show it. Fritz grew up in the crossfire of this psychological warfare. His father wanted to create a clone of himself, a marching machine. His mother wanted to create a philosopher king, a modern ruler for a modern age. Miraculously, Fritz absorbed the best of both. He possessed the physical presence of a Hohenzollern, tall, broad-shouldered, with a booming baritone voice and a natural aptitude for command. Yet beneath the uniform, he possessed his mother's sensitivity. He was the first Prussian crown prince to attend a university, studying law and history at Bonn, where he mingled with middle-class students and absorbed the dangerous ideas of constitutionalism. It was during these formative years that the Prussian problem became clear to him. Prussia was a state with a modern army, but a medieval political soul. The Industrial Revolution was sweeping through the Rhineland, creating a wealthy, educated bourgeoisie that demanded a voice in government. The old Junker aristocracy, however, refused to yield an inch of power. Fritz saw that for the monarchy to survive, it had to evolve. It had to make peace with the people. This belief would make him a hero to the public and a traitor to his own caste. The trajectory of his life and the fate of the world shifted irrevocably in 1851. During a visit to London for the Great Exhibition, the young Prince Frederick met Victoria, the Princess Royal, the eldest daughter of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Vicky, as she was known, was only 11 years old at the time, but the match was already being calculated by the adults. Prince Albert, the visionary consort of Britain, dreamed of a united liberal Germany that would be a partner, not a rival, to Britain. He saw in Fritz the perfect vessel for this dream. When they married in 1858, it was not merely a dynastic union. It was an ideological merger. Vicky was 18, brilliant, opinionated, and fiercely trained by her father in politics and statecraft. She was not a passive royal consort. She was a woman who read Karl Marx and Adam Smith, who understood the intricacies of parliamentary procedure better than most Prussian ministers. Fritz adored her. For the first time in his life, he had a partner who understood his isolation. They were genuinely in love, a rarity in royal circles, and their shared domesticity, reading together, discussing policy, raising their children with affection rather than discipline, scandalized the stiff Prussian court. But to the conservatives in Berlin, Vicky was the English woman. She was a foreign virus injected into the healthy body of the Prussian state. They whispered that she dominated her husband, that she was turning a Prussian prince into a weak British liberal. The leader of this chorus of hatred was Otto von Bismarck. In 1862, the simmering tension between the old Prussia and the new erupted. Fritz's father, now King Wilhelm I, clashed with the Prussian parliament over military budget reforms. The king, frustrated by the refusal of the liberals to fund his army, threatened to abdicate. Instead, he summoned Bismarck. Bismarck's solution was simple. He would rule without a budget, ignoring the Constitution and crushing the opposition. He famously declared that the great questions of the time would be decided not by speeches and majority decisions, but by blood and iron. Fritz was horrified. He saw Bismarck's coup as a violation of the law and a stain on the honor of the monarchy. The conflict came to a head in the port city of Danzig in 1863. During a civic reception, Fritz made a speech that sent shockwaves through the kingdom. He publicly disavowed his father's government, stating coldly that he had nothing to do with the unconstitutional acts of the ministry. It was an act of breathtaking courage, a crown prince openly rebuking the king and his prime minister. The king was apoplectic. He threatened to arrest his own son for treason and strip him of his military command. Bismarck, cunning as ever, advised against making Fritz a martyr, but he never forgave the slight. From that day forward, Bismarck engaged in a systematic campaign to isolate the crown prince. He utilized the press to paint Fritz as a henpecked husband controlled by his British wife. He kept Fritz out of important meetings, denied him access to state papers, and ensured that the crown prince's party remained powerless. Yet Fritz could not be completely sidelined, for he was a soldier, and the 1860s were a decade of war. In 1864, Prussia marched against Denmark. In 1866, the Brother War against Austria broke out. It was in Bohemia at the Battle of Königgrätz that Fritz proved his mettle. The Prussian armies were divided, and the main force was taking a beating from the Austrian artillery. The battle hung in the balance. The king and Bismarck watched anxiously from a hilltop, fearing a catastrophe. Then on the horizon, the army of the crown prince appeared. Fritz had marched his men through mud and rain, arriving at the critical moment to smash into the Austrian flank. It was the decisive blow. The Austrian army collapsed. As Fritz rode up to his father on the battlefield, the old king, overcome with emotion, embraced him and pinned the Pour le Mérite, the blue max, Prussia's highest military honor, onto his tunic. For a brief moment, father and son were united in victory, but the unity was an illusion. In the aftermath of the victory, the difference between Fritz and Bismarck became stark. Bismarck wanted to cripple Austria, but keep her as a future ally. The king wanted to annex territory. Fritz, however, was appalled by the carnage. Walking the battlefield the next day, he wrote in his diary not of glory, but of the screaming wounded, the piles of limbs, and the smell of death. War, he wrote, is an atrocity that should only be entered into when all other means have failed. He was a general who despised his own trade. 4 years later, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 brought the final unification of Germany. Again, Fritz commanded an army. Again, he was decisive, winning the early battles at Wissembourg and Wörth that opened the road to Paris. But as the siege of Paris dragged on, the rift deepened. Bismarck wanted to shell the city into submission, to terrorize the civilian population. Fritz and Vicky were outraged. They argued that bombarding a city of civilians was a war crime that would stain Germany's reputation forever. They pleaded for a diplomatic solution. Bismarck mocked them, sneering that the Englishwoman cared more about French buildings than German soldiers. The shelling went ahead. Paris fell. On January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the German Empire was proclaimed. Wilhelm I was emperor. Fritz was now the crown prince of the dominant power in Europe. He was 40 years old. He was at the height of his physical and intellectual powers. He was ready to rule. And then the waiting began in earnest. The 1870s and 1880s were the years of Fritz's purgatory. The new German Empire was a glorious shell with a rotten core. It was an economic powerhouse leading the world in chemicals, steel, and electricity. But politically, it was frozen. Bismarck had created a system designed for himself, a complex web of alliances and domestic compromises that only a genius could manage. He persecuted Catholics in the Kulturkampf. He outlawed the Social Democrats, and he manipulated the Reichstag like a puppet master. Fritz and Vicky watched in despair. They saw that Bismarck was creating a nation of subjects, not citizens. They saw that by suppressing dissent, Bismarck was driving the working class into the arms of radicals. They saw that the aggressive nationalism being taught in schools was creating a generation that worshipped force. They planned for the day they would take the throne. They drafted proclamations. They cultivated a circle of liberal scholars and scientists. They maintained close ties with Britain, hoping to forge an Anglo-German alliance that would secure the peace of the world. But the old emperor refused to die. Wilhelm I was made of iron. He survived assassination attempts. He survived illnesses. He marched into his 80s, then his 90s. As the years ticked by, Fritz's beard turned gray. His idealism began to be tinged with bitterness. He was the Prince Perpetual, the man who was always next, but never now. Worst of all was the alienation of his eldest son. Young Wilhelm, the future Wilhelm II, was born with a withered arm, a result of a traumatic breech birth. Vicky, driven by guilt and a relentless perfectionism, subjected the boy to harsh treatments to fix him, including electric shocks and bizarre contraptions to stretch his neck. The boy grew up hating his mother and adoring his grandfather and Bismarck. Bismarck saw the opportunity. He bypassed Fritz and began to groom young Wilhelm. He fed the boy's ego, telling him that he was the true heir to the Prussian tradition, unlike his weak liberal father. He encouraged Wilhelm's arrogance and his militarism. Fritz watched helplessly as his own son was turned into a weapon against him. Young Wilhelm openly mocked his father's liberalism, calling him an old woman. The saga of the Hohenzollerns was descending into a Greek tragedy, a family tearing itself apart on the stage of world history. By 1886, the atmosphere in Berlin was toxic. The court was divided into camps. The Bismarck party looked at the aging crown prince with disdain, whispering that he would never rule, or that if he did, it would be a disaster. The crown prince's party was shrinking, losing hope as the years dragged on. Then came January 1887. The year started with celebrations. It was to be the year of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. Fritz was 55 years old. He was still a striking figure, appearing in public in his white cuirassier uniform, a towering image of regal health. But in the quiet of his dressing room, he began to notice something annoying, a persistent hoarseness, a tickle in the throat that no amount of tea or honey could soothe. He was a smoker, like most men of his class, but he had never had throat trouble before. At first he ignored it. It was winter in Berlin, everyone had a cough, but the hoarseness didn't go away. It worsened. His voice, once capable of shouting commands across a battlefield, began to rasp and crack. During conversations, he found himself clearing his throat constantly. His personal physician, Dr. Wegener, took a look. He saw a small, pale swelling on the left vocal cord. He assumed it was a simple catarrhal inflammation. He prescribed gargles and rest. But the weeks passed and the voice did not return. The swelling remained. The waiting was almost over. The throne was finally within sight. But fate, it seemed, had one final cruel card to play. The Prince Perpetual was about to face an enemy that no army could defeat and no liberal constitution could outlaw. The tragedy of the 99 days was beginning, not with a roar, but with a whisper. In the hushed, velvet-draped corridors of the Crown Prince's palace in Berlin, a new battlefront was opening. It was not a war of cannons or cavalry, but a war of scalpels, microscopes, and bruised egos. The year 1887 would become the most scrutinized year in the history of laryngology, a year where the fate of an empire hung on the interpretation of a few millimeters of tissue. By March 1887, the harmless catarrh that Dr. Wegener had diagnosed showed no sign of abating. The Crown Prince's voice was a ruin. It was no longer a commanding baritone, but a strained, breathless rasp. The small, pale swelling on the left vocal cord had grown. It was now a distinct nodule, angry and persistent. Wegener, realizing the gravity of the situation and perhaps the danger to his own career, should he misstep, called for reinforcements. He summoned Professor Karl Gerhardt, one of Germany's leading internists. Gerhardt's examination was torture disguised as medicine. In an age before fiber optics, the doctor had to use a laryngeal mirror, a small angled piece of glass on a long metal handle, shoved deep into the throat while the patient pulled his own tongue forward with a napkin. Light was reflected from a head mirror into the dark cavern of the airway. Fritz endured this with the stoicism of a soldier, though the gag reflex was constant and violent. Gerhardt saw the growth. He decided it was a polyp and attempted to remove it with a wire snare. It failed. He then tried to burn it away with a red-hot galvanic cautery wire. For weeks, the Crown Prince of Prussia sat in a chair, opening his mouth to smell the singed flesh of his own throat. The pain was excruciating, yet the growth refused to die. Instead, it seemed to feed on the trauma, growing larger, harder, and more irregular. Panic began to set in among the German medical team. On May 18th, they brought in the heavy artillery, Ernst von Bergmann. Bergmann was a titan of German surgery. He was a man of action, a pioneer of aseptic techniques, and a surgeon who believed that to cut was to cure. He took one look at the ulcerating mass in Fritz's throat and did not hesitate. His diagnosis was grim and immediate: cancer. Bergmann proposed a radical solution, a laryngo fissure. He would slice open the Crown Prince's neck from the outside, split the thyroid cartilage, and excise the tumor along with a portion of the vocal cord. It was a brutal, bloody operation with a high mortality rate. If Fritz survived, he would likely lose his voice forever. But, Bergmann argued, it was the only chance to save his life. The logic was cold and Prussian. Sacrifice the voice to save the emperor. The news hit Vicky like a physical blow. She was terrified. She had seen her father-in-law, the old emperor, survive multiple assassination attempts and illnesses without surgery. She distrusted the aggressive, militaristic nature of German medicine, which she felt treated patients like biological battlefields. To her, Bergman was not a savior. He was a butcher sharpening his knives. She frantically stalled, demanding time. She argued that a diagnosis of cancer had not been proven microscopically. How could they mutilate the future emperor based on a hunch? Under immense pressure, the German doctors agreed to a compromise. They would allow a foreign specialist to examine the patient, a neutral party. Since laryngology was a field where British medicine was highly respected, the choice fell on Dr. Morel Mackenzie of London. If Bergman was the archetype of the stern German professor, Morel Mackenzie was the archetype of the dashing Victorian celebrity doctor. He was charismatic, wealthy, and arguably the most famous throat specialist in the world. He operated a clinic on Golden Square in London that saw thousands of patients a year. But in the medical fraternity, he was viewed with suspicion. He was considered a showman, a doctor who courted publicity and perhaps played fast and loose with medical ethics. Mackenzie arrived in Berlin on the evening of May 20th, 1887. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The German doctors viewed him as an interloper. The court viewed him as a curiosity, and Vicky viewed him as a lifeline. The examination the next morning was a showdown. Mackenzie looked into the prince's throat and declared that he saw no evidence of cancer. He asserted that it looked like a benign fibroma, perhaps caused by the trauma of Gerhardt's cauterizations. He stated confidently that a biopsy was needed. If the tissue was benign, he could cure the prince with conservative treatment, rest, and gentle localized applications, sparing him the horror of the knife. The relief in the room was palpable. Vicky wept with joy. The crown prince, who had been preparing himself for death or mutilation, smiled, but Bergman scowled. He knew what he saw. On May 21st, Mackenzie attempted to take a biopsy. It was a disaster. He used a pair of laryngeal forceps, a terrifying instrument resembling a long pair of scissors, with a small biting jaw at the end. He passed the instrument into Fritz's throat blindly, guiding it by feel. He snapped the jaws shut and pulled. He came away with a small fragment of tissue. However, when the German doctors examined the sample, they claimed Mackenzie had missed the tumor entirely and had merely snipped a piece of the healthy right vocal cord. Mackenzie denied it. The tension escalated. A few days later, Mackenzie tried again. This time, he retrieved a substantial chunk of the growth. The fate of the German Empire was now sealed in a jar of alcohol. The sample was sent to the highest authority in the land, Professor Rudolf Virchow. Virchow was a legend, the founder of cellular pathology. If Virchow said it was cancer, it was cancer. If he said it was benign, it was benign. The world held its breath. Virchow's report arrived like a divine decree. He had examined the tissue under the microscope and found no evidence of malignancy. He diagnosed it as pachydermia verrucosa, a warty thickening of the skin, likely caused by chronic inflammation. It was benign. The explosion of joy in the Crown Prince's household was matched only by the explosion of rage in the German medical community. Mackenzie was hailed as a hero, a genius, who had saved the Crown Prince from the bloodthirsty German surgeons. Bergman and his colleagues were humiliated. They were painted in the press as incompetent butchers who had almost murdered the heir to the throne for a benign wart. In the glow of this miracle, the surgery was canceled. Mackenzie took charge of the patient. He recommended that Fritz come to England for the Queen's Golden Jubilee and then spend the summer in the fresh air of the Scottish Highlands, where Mackenzie could treat him daily. June 1887 in London was a spectacle of imperial grandeur. Kings and queens from across the globe gathered to celebrate Queen Victoria's 50 years on the throne, but the star of the show was undoubtedly Frederick. Dressed in the white uniform of the Pomeranian cuirassiers, wearing a silver eagle helmet and a golden breastplate, he rode through the streets of London like a Wagnerian god. He was taller than any other royal, more handsome, more majestic. The crowds cheered him wildly. But those close to him saw the truth. He was a silent god. He could not speak above a whisper. He looked pale and tired. While the world saw a hero, he felt like an invalid. Throughout the summer, Mackenzie treated the throat. He removed more pieces of the growth. He applied powders and astringents. He assured everyone that the prince was healing. In reports to Queen Victoria, Mackenzie was optimistic. He became the darling of the British public and the enemy of the German press. In Germany, the mood was turning ugly. The newspapers, fed leaks by Bismarck's circle, began to frame the medical issue as a political conspiracy. They claimed that the English doctor was keeping the prince alive artificially or hiding the truth to ensure that Vicky became empress. They whispered that a mute emperor could not rule under Prussian law. The medical debate became a proxy war for the soul of Germany. The honest, hard German science versus the slippery, deceptive English influence. As autumn approached, the weather in Scotland turned damp and cold. Mackenzie recommended a move to a warmer climate. The royal entourage moved to San Remo on the Italian Riviera. They settled into the Villa Zirio, a white mansion surrounded by olive groves and overlooking the blue Mediterranean. It was a paradise, a place of peace where Fritz hoped to finally recover his voice. But the biology of the tumor did not care about the Italian sun. In late October, the hoarseness worsened. Fritz began to feel a dull pain radiating to his ear. He coughed up blood. Mackenzie, ever the optimist, dismissed it as a temporary setback. But on November 5th, 1887, a date that should be marked in black in the history books, Mackenzie looked into the throat and froze. The benign growth had not disappeared. It had exploded. A new, ominous mass had appeared below the vocal cords. It was ulcerated, red, and angry. The smell of rotting tissue, the distinct, sickly sweet odor of advanced laryngeal cancer, was faint but unmistakable. Mackenzie, the man who had staked his reputation, his knighthood, and the peace of Europe on a benign diagnosis, finally collapsed. He summoned the German doctors back. On November 9th, a grim summit was held at the Villa Zirio. Mackenzie, Schmidt, Krauss, and the other specialists gathered. They examined the prince. There was no longer any doubt. The tumor was malignant. It was growing rapidly. And because they had waited 6 months of cures and denial, it was now inoperable. The cancer had spread too far for a laryngeal fissure. The only surgical option left was a total laryngectomy, the complete removal of the voice box. In 1887, this was a procedure of such brutality and lethality that it was practically an execution. They had to tell the patient. The scene in the drawing room of the Villa Zirio is one of the most poignant in royal history. The doctors stood in a semicircle, grave and black-coated. Fritz entered, looking regal but anxious. Vicky stood by his side, clutching his hand, her face a mask of terror. Mackenzie, his voice trembling, delivered the verdict. He admitted he had been wrong. It was cancer. There was no cure. Fritz listened in silence. He did not rage. He did not cry. He squeezed Vicky's hand as she burst into tears. Then he wrote on his notepad, "I thank you for your sincerity." He turned to the doctors and asked, via the pad, how long he had left. They could not say. A few months, maybe a year. The Prince Perpetual now had a deadline. The tragedy was that the throne was still occupied by his father. Wilhelm I was 90, frail, but alive. Fritz was 56 and dying. He faced the grotesque possibility of dying before his father, of never reigning at all, or, perhaps worse, reigning as a mute, dying man while his enemies circled. The decision was made to forego the total laryngectomy. Fritz chose to die intact rather than live as a butchered experiment. He would accept palliative care. He would wait for the end, but the end would not be peaceful. The tumor grew with terrifying speed. By January 1888, the airway was narrowing. Fritz began to suffocate. The sound of his breathing became a high-pitched stridor, a terrifying whistle that echoed through the villa. He could not sleep, terrified that if he closed his eyes, he would never open them again. On February 9th, 1888, the crisis point arrived. Fritz was gasping for air. His face was blue. The tumor had effectively sealed his windpipe. The doctors told Vicky that unless they performed an immediate tracheotomy, cutting a hole in the windpipe below the tumor to insert a breathing tube, he would be dead within the hour. Vicky, who had fought so hard to keep the knives away, finally surrendered. "Do it," she whispered. The operation was performed not in a sterile theater, but in the bedroom of the villa. Dr. Brahman, Bergman's assistant, performed the cut. As the scalpel sliced into the trachea, air hissed into the starving lungs. Fritz took a massive, shuddering breath. He was alive, but the price was absolute silence. The silver cannula in his throat bypassed the vocal cords entirely. He would never speak again. The German Messiah was now a mute. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the old Emperor Wilhelm I was finally fading. The winter of 1888 was harsh. The old man caught a cold which turned into pneumonia. As March arrived, the telegrams to San Remo became more urgent. The emperor is sinking. The end is near. Fritz sat in his chair in San Remo, the silver tube in his throat, reading the messages. He was a man trapped between two worlds. He was about to inherit the greatest power in Europe, yet he was physically incapable of issuing a spoken command. He was an emperor in waiting, but he was also a corpse in waiting. The waiting was over. The tragedy was about to move from the sick room to the throne room. The telegram arrived at the Villa Zirio in San Remo at 11 a.m. on March 9th, 1888. Outside, the Italian sun was shining on the orange groves, the air thick with the scent of blossoms. Inside, the atmosphere was funereal. The message was brief, stripped of all emotion by the telegraph wires. His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Wilhelm I, has passed away. At that precise moment, the world shifted. The 90-year-old patriarch, the symbol of Prussian invincibility, was gone. And in a drawing room on the Riviera, a dying man stood up. Frederick William was no longer the crown prince. He was now Frederick III, German Emperor and King of Prussia. The scene that followed was one of the most heartbreaking in the annals of royalty. The members of his household, generals, courtiers, servants, rushed to kneel before him to swear their allegiance. They looked up at a figure who possessed the physical majesty of a Charlemagne, tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard that was now streaked with gray. He wore the sash of the Order of the Black Eagle. He looked every inch an emperor. But when he opened his mouth to acknowledge their loyalty, to speak the words that history demanded, there was only a wet, rasping sound of air escaping through the silver tube in his neck. He stopped. His eyes filled with a profound, tragic sorrow. He reached for a notepad. With a trembling hand, he wrote his first command as emperor. It was not a decree of war or a political manifesto. It was a note to his wife. He took the ribbon of the Order of the Black Eagle from his own chest and pinned it onto Vicky's dress. On the pad, he wrote, "For your courage and your love." It was a gesture of defiance. By honoring the Englishwoman in his first moments of power, he was signaling to Berlin that he was not a puppet. But it was also a gesture of farewell. The new emperor had to return to his capital. The journey north from San Remo to Berlin was a surreal odyssey, a transition from light into darkness, from life into death. As the royal train chugged through Italy and up into the Alps, the weather turned against them. The sunshine of the Mediterranean gave way to gray skies, then sleet, and finally a blinding blizzard. It was as if nature itself was mourning the tragedy. The train was a mobile hospital. One carriage was equipped with medical supplies, oxygen tanks, and sterilized instruments. Dr. Mackenzie and the medical team hovered constantly. The emperor sat in his compartment wrapped in furs, coughing violently. Every jolt of the tracks caused agony in his inflamed throat. When the train crossed the German border at Munich, the crowds were there. They stood in the freezing rain, thousands of them, waiting to see their new Kaiser. They cheered, waving flags and throwing flowers at the passing carriages. But the windows remained shut. The emperor did not wave. He could not risk the cold air entering his open windpipe. To his subjects, he was a ghost behind glass, a rumored presence, invisible and silent. They arrived in Berlin on the night of March 11th. The city was buried under snow. The temperature was sub-zero. The streets were draped in black crepe for the dead Wilhelm I. The gas lamps flickered in the wind, casting long, dancing shadows. Frederick did not ride in a state carriage through the Brandenburg Gate as he had always dreamed. Instead, he was whisked away in a closed carriage to the Charlottenburg Palace on the outskirts of the city. The doctors had forbidden him to live in the drafty city palace. Berlin was buzzing with rumors. The conservative press, directed by Bismarck's hidden hand, was already spinning the narrative. They whispered that the emperor was insane, that the cancer had spread to his brain. They claimed he was too weak to sign his name. They questioned the legality of a mute Kaiser. The Bismarck party was terrified that Frederick, even in his dying days, might dismiss the chancellor and wreck their conservative paradise. But Frederick surprised them all. He was dying, yes. He was in constant pain, yes. But his mind was crystal clear. On his second day in Berlin, he summoned Otto von Bismarck. The meeting between the two titans of the age was a study in contrasts. Bismarck, age 73, was physically declining himself, bloated, prone to fits of weeping and gluttony, but politically as sharp as a razor. He entered the emperor's study expecting to find a broken invalid. He found a man sitting upright at his desk wearing a general's uniform. Frederick could not speak, but he could stare. And he stared at Bismarck with the cold, hard eyes of a Hohenzollern. Bismarck began to speak, launching into a monologue about the necessity of maintaining the status quo, of the dangers of liberalism, of the need to extend the anti-socialist laws. He spoke as if he were the master and Frederick the pupil. Frederick listened. Then he picked up his pen. He wrote a question on a slip of paper and pushed it across the desk. Bismarck read it and paused. The question was about the Constitution. Frederick was asking why the ministers were not being consulted on specific policies. For the next hour, a strange duel played out. Bismarck thundered and blustered, using his voice as a weapon. Frederick countered with silence and ink. He wrote short, sharp notes. No persecution of the Jews. The press must be free to criticize. I wish to see the French ambassador. Bismarck left the meeting shaken. He told his aides the emperor is ill, but he is emperor. He realized that the English influence was stronger than he thought. He immediately went to work to sabotage the new regime. He ordered the bureaucracy to slow down. Documents were lost. Ministers were suddenly unavailable for meetings. It was a bureaucratic blockade designed to run out the clock on a dying man. Despite the obstruction, Frederick managed to issue two proclamations that shook the foundations of the German establishment. The first was his proclamation to the German people. In it, he did not speak of blood and iron or military glory. Instead, he spoke of the welfare of the people, education, and justice. He declared that the emperor was the servant of the law, not its master. It was a manifesto of liberal monarchy, a glimpse of what Germany could have been. The liberals in the Reichstag wept when they read it. For 30 years, they had waited for this language. The second act was more personal. He fired Robert von Puttkamer, the ultra-conservative interior minister. Puttkamer was Bismarck's brother-in-law and his hatchet man. He had rigged elections, persecuted socialists, and enforced censorship. Frederick, with a stroke of his pen, dismissed him. It was a direct blow to Bismarck's power structure. It showed that the silent emperor had teeth, but every victory exhausted him. The cancer was relentless. The tumor was rotting. The smell in the sick room became overpowering. It was the smell of gangrene. Courtiers who entered the room had to hold handkerchiefs to their faces. Vicky burned incense and sprayed perfume, but the scent of death hung heavy in the velvet curtains. Frederick was humiliated by his own decay. He was a fastidious man, proud of his appearance. Now he had to be fed through a tube. He coughed up pieces of necrotic tissue. He had to have the silver cannula removed and cleaned daily, a procedure that felt like drowning. Yet he insisted on dressing in uniform every day. He sat at his desk, writing, signing, reading. He was determined to die like a king. While Frederick fought for his legacy, his son, Crown Prince Wilhelm, was fighting for his inheritance. The behavior of the 29-year-old Wilhelm during these 99 days is one of the darkest chapters in his life. He did not act like a grieving son, he acted like a vulture. He surrounded the Charlottenburg Palace with a ring of security, which was effectively a siege. He placed guards at the gates who reported who came and went. He intercepted his mother's mail. He was terrified that his parents were smuggling state secrets to England. Wilhelm spent his days strutting around the barracks in Potsdam, railing against the Jewish liberal clique that surrounded his dying father. He openly criticized the emperor to the generals. "My father is a dead man," he told them. "We must look to the future." One incident captures the cruelty of the son. One afternoon, Frederick felt strong enough to take a walk in the palace gardens. He was wrapped in blankets and pushed in a wheelchair. At the gate, he saw a sentry on guard. The emperor, remembering his days as a soldier, gestured for the sentry to come closer so he could inspect him. The sentry did not move. He stared straight ahead. Frederick gestured again angrily. The soldier remained frozen. An officer approached and saluted, but said, "Your Majesty, the Crown Prince has given orders that the guard is to take commands only from him." Frederick slumped back in his wheelchair. He had been stripped of his command in his own garden. He wrote in his diary that night, "I am treated like a prisoner in my own house." The tension between the emperor and the chancellor came to a breaking point over a marriage. Vicky wanted to marry their second daughter, Princess Victoria, to Prince Alexander of Battenberg. Sandro was handsome, charming, and the former Prince of Bulgaria. He was also a bitter enemy of the Russian Tsar. Bismarck was furious. He argued that such a marriage would alienate Russia and push Germany into a war. He threatened to resign if the marriage went ahead. Normally, a threat of resignation from Bismarck would terrify a Prussian king. But Frederick was past fear. He wanted the marriage. He saw it as a personal matter, a chance for his daughter to be happy. The Battenberg affair consumed weeks of the short reign. It was a proxy war. Bismarck leaked vicious stories to the press, attacking the Empress Vicky as a traitor who was willing to sacrifice German blood for her daughter's romance. The newspapers, controlled by Bismarck's reptile fund, tore the royal family apart. In the end, Frederick, too weak to fight the combined weight of the chancellor and the Russian pressure, capitulated. He wrote a heartbreaking note to his daughter. "I cannot make you happy." It was his biggest defeat. Bismarck had proven that even a dying emperor could be bullied. By late May, the Charlottenburg Palace became too hot and dusty. The doctors recommended a move to the new palace in Potsdam, the place where Frederick had been born. It was to be his final journey. On June 1st, the emperor boarded a steamboat to travel down the River Spree to Potsdam. He could not ride in a carriage. The bumps would suffocate him. The boat trip was a silent funeral procession. Crowds lined the riverbanks. They watched the boat pass, a black silhouette against the setting sun. They saw the emperor sitting on the deck, waving a handkerchief. He arrived at the new palace, which he renamed Friedrichskron, in a last attempt to stamp his identity on history. But the palace was a tomb. It was huge, damp, and filled with the ghosts of his ancestors. He was brought to a ground-floor room that opened onto the terrace. He lay in bed, looking out at the park where he had played as a boy. The circle was closing. The 99 days were running out. He was now living on morphine and willpower. He slept fitfully, waking up choking. He wrote less and less. His handwriting, once firm and elegant, became a scrawl. But he kept one picture on his bedside table, a photograph of his father, Wilhelm I. Despite everything, he remained a dutiful Prussian son. He was trying to hold the line, but the line was breaking. Outside the palace gates, the regiments were gathering. Wilhelm II was ready. The year of 3 emperors was about to claim its second victim. The liberal spring was over. The winter of the world was coming. The new palace in Potsdam is a colossal structure, a Baroque testament to Prussian power built by Frederick the Great to prove that the state was still wealthy after the 7 Years' War. In June 1888, it became a mausoleum for a living man. Frederick III had come home to die. The move from Berlin had exhausted his last reserves of strength. He was installed in the Jasper Gallery, a room filled with priceless art, but the windows were kept open to carry away the stench of the disease. The summer of 1888 was mocking him with its beauty. The park outside was lush and green. The Havel River sparkled in the sun, but the emperor was confined to a world of shadows, morphine, and ice packs. The medical details of these final 2 weeks are harrowing. The cancer had eroded the esophagus. Swallowing was impossible. The doctors attempted to feed the emperor through a rubber tube pushed down his nose. It was a torture that occurred several times a day. Frederick, who had once led cavalry charges, now had to be held down while liquid was forced into his stomach. He bore it with a heartbreaking gentleness, often apologizing to the doctors for the trouble he was causing. His body was consuming itself. He had lost nearly half his body weight. The magnificent uniform of the cuirassiers now hung on him like a shroud. Yet his mind remained lucid, trapped in the decaying wreckage of his frame. He continued to read the newspapers. He continued to sign documents, though his hand shook so violently that the signature Friedrich became an illegible, jagged line. On June 13th, King Oscar II of Sweden came to visit. Frederick insisted on receiving him standing up, fully dressed in his uniform, with his orders and decorations. It was a supreme act of will. He stood for a few minutes, playing the part of the emperor, nodding and gesturing. As soon as King Oscar left, Frederick collapsed. It was his final public performance. On the morning of June 14th, the end was clearly visible. The emperor's eyes were glazed. His breathing was shallow. He signaled for his notepad. He wrote a few shaky words, not about empires or wars, but about the simple, crushing reality of his existence. To be an emperor is difficult. Later that day, he wrote his final message to his wife. He looked at Vicky, whose hair had turned white in the last 3 months, and scribbled, "Victoria, I am tired." It was the permission she needed to let him go. She stopped the doctors from forcing more food on him. She sat by his bedside, holding his hand, whispering to him in English, the language of their love. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock and the rasping breath of the dying man. The morning of June 15th broke with a gray, drizzling rain. The emperor was drifting in and out of consciousness. Around 11 a.m., his breathing changed. The death rattle began. The family gathered. Wilhelm, the crown prince, stood at the foot of the bed, posing more than grieving, watching his father with a strange, intense curiosity. At 11:30 a.m., Frederick III took a deep breath. His eyes opened wide for a moment, and then he was gone. The reign of 99 days was over. The silence that followed should have been a moment of reverence. Instead, it was the starting gun for a coup. The moment the doctor pronounced the emperor dead, the new Kaiser snapped into action. There was no time for grief, only for power. He did not comfort his mother. He did not pray. He marched out of the death chamber and issued a pre-planned order. Within minutes, a regiment of hussars surrounded the new palace. Soldiers with fixed bayonets appeared at every door and window. The gates were locked. The telegraph wires were cut. No one was allowed to leave. The staff, the doctors, and even the Empress Vicky were effectively placed under house arrest. Wilhelm was acting on a paranoid delusion that his mother was about to smuggle state secrets to England. He ordered a search of his parents' private rooms. Officers ransacked desks, tore open drawers, and ripped through correspondence. It was a violation of privacy so gross that it shocked even the hardened Prussian courtiers. They found nothing. Vicky, anticipating her son's treachery, had already sent the most sensitive boxes of letters to Windsor Castle weeks earlier via the British ambassador. Wilhelm was left with nothing but his own cruelty. The treatment of the body was equally shameful. Wilhelm ordered an immediate autopsy, ostensibly to prove the doctors wrong, but in reality, it felt like a final violation. The pathologist confirmed the cancer, but the dignity of the dead monarch was an afterthought. The funeral was rushed. There was no lying in state for the public. Wilhelm claimed it was too hot, that the body was decomposing too fast, but the people of Berlin felt cheated. They wanted to mourn their Unser Fritz. Instead, he was buried in the Friedenskirche in Potsdam on June 18th, the anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. The ceremony was short, tense, and military. The church was filled with generals, not the people. Vicky, heavily veiled, stood alone, isolated by the court that now looked to the young son, Wilhelm II. As the coffin was lowered into the crypt, the liberal era of Germany was buried with it. It had not even survived the summer. The eclipse was total. Within weeks, the atmosphere in Germany changed completely. The Frederikian ideas, tolerance, patience, cooperation with Britain, were swept away. Wilhelm II began his reign with a flurry of activity that signaled a new, dangerous direction. He issued a proclamation to the army before he issued one to the people. "We belong to each other," he told the soldiers, "I and the army." He humiliated his mother, forcing her to leave the new palace and retire to a smaller estate. He banned the erection of monuments to his father that depicted him in civilian clothes. Frederick was only to be remembered as a soldier, not a liberal. He encouraged the persecution of the doctors who had treated Frederick, especially Mackenzie, who became the target of a vicious hate campaign in the German press. Dr. Mackenzie returned to London a broken man. His reputation was ruined by the German accusations of malpractice. He wrote a defensive book, the fatal illness of Frederick the Noble, which only added to the scandal. He died a few years later, a victim of the stress of those 99 days. As the summer of 1888 turned to autumn, the memory of the mute emperor began to fade. The factories of the Ruhr churned out steel. The shipyards of Hamburg began to lay the keels for the new battleships that Wilhelm demanded. The speeches in the Reichstag became louder, more aggressive, more nationalistic. The year of three emperors ended with a young man in a hurry at the helm. Wilhelm II was eager to crash onto the world stage. He wanted a place in the sun for Germany. He dismissed the caution of his father as weakness. He dismissed the wisdom of Bismarck as senility. The safety valve of the German Empire had been removed. The pressure began to build. The body of Frederick III lay in the Friedenskirche, but his ghost refused to stay buried. As the 19th century wound down and the 20th century dawned, the absence of the silent emperor became a presence in itself. Every diplomatic blunder, every saber-rattling speech, and every step toward the abyss of 1914 can be traced back to the void left by his death. To understand the magnitude of the disaster, we must look not just at what happened, but at what was murdered alongside the emperor. The first casualty of Frederick's death was the German liberal movement. For 30 years, the progressives in Germany, the lawyers, the journalists, the scientists, the growing middle class, had pinned their hopes on Unser Fritz. They had endured Bismarck's repression because they believed that one day the crown prince would ascend and the Iron Age would end. They believed that Germany would naturally evolve into a constitutional monarchy like Britain. When Frederick died after only 99 days, that hope was extinguished. The liberals were politically orphaned. Wilhelm II, with his love of uniforms and his disdain for scribblers and parliamentarians, made it clear that the future belonged to the army and the aristocracy. The psychological impact on the German people was profound. The lesson they learned in 1888 was that liberalism was weak, sickly, and doomed to failure. Militarism, on the other hand, was young, vigorous, and triumphant. The cult of the uniform exploded. To be a civilian was to be a second-class citizen. This shift in the national psyche, the rejection of the pen for the sword, prepared the ground for the catastrophic enthusiasm with which Germany marched to war in 1914. The tragedy is deepened by the character of the man who took the throne. Wilhelm II was a man at war with himself. He was intelligent but emotionally unstable, arrogant but deeply insecure. Historians now believe he likely suffered from narcissistic personality disorder, exacerbated by the trauma of his birth and his difficult relationship with his mother. Wilhelm defined his reign in opposition to his father. Where Frederick was calm, Wilhelm was hysterical. Where Frederick was patient, Wilhelm was impulsive. Where Frederick sought the advice of experts, Wilhelm believed he was directly inspired by God. In 1890, just 2 years after his father's death, Wilhelm fired Otto von Bismarck. It was the moment Frederick had likely planned for, but with a crucial difference. Frederick would have fired Bismarck to liberalize the Constitution and empower the Reichstag. Wilhelm fired Bismarck to rule as a personal autocrat. He wanted no iron chancellor overshadowing him. He wanted to be his own chancellor, his own foreign minister, and his own field marshal. The pilot had been dropped, but there was no one left to steer the ship. The most tangible consequence of the premature death was the destruction of the European alliance system. Frederick III was a confirmed Anglophile. He spoke English with his wife. He admired the British political system, and he was the favorite son-in-law of Queen Victoria. Had he lived, an Anglo-German alliance, or at least a deeply friendly understanding, was almost inevitable. A Germany allied with Britain would have been the superpower of the world, but a stabilizing one. Britain ruled the waves, Germany ruled the continent. Together they could have dictated peace to Europe for a century. Wilhelm II destroyed this possibility with breathtaking speed. Fueled by an inferiority complex toward his British relatives, he decided that Germany needed a massive navy to challenge the Royal Navy. This decision, the Tirpitz Plan, was the single greatest strategic error of the era. It forced Britain out of its splendid isolation and into the arms of Germany's enemies, France and Russia. If Frederick had lived, there would have been no naval race. Frederick understood that Germany was a land power. He had no desire to challenge his wife's country for control of the oceans. Without the naval threat, Britain would never have signed the Entente Cordiale with France. The encirclement of Germany, the nightmare that drove them to strike first in 1914, would never have happened. The other pillar of Bismarck's security system was the reinsurance treaty with Russia. It was a secret agreement that ensured Russia and Germany would not go to war. It was cynical, but it kept the peace. Frederick, though he disliked the Russian autocracy, understood the necessity of keeping the wire to St. Petersburg open. Wilhelm II, however, allowed the treaty to lapse in 1890, believing that his personal relationship with his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, was enough. It was not. Russia, feeling abandoned, turned to France. The Franco-Russian alliance was born, the vice that would eventually crush Germany in a two-front war. While Europe drifted toward catastrophe, the human tragedy continued to play out in the lonely castles of Germany. The Empress Dowager Victoria, Vicky, survived her husband by 13 years. They were years of bitterness and sorrow. She was ostracized by the court she had once hoped to lead. Her son Wilhelm spies on her, ignored her advice, and undid her husband's work. She watched in horror as he made speeches that alienated the world. "Wilhelm is mad," she wrote in her letters to her mother, Queen Victoria. "He is destroying everything." She dedicated her final years to building a memorial to Frederick, not a statue of a conqueror, but a hospital and a library. She wanted him to be remembered as a man of peace, but even in this, she was thwarted. The official history books written under Wilhelm's gaze painted Frederick as a tragic but weak interlude between the two great Wilhelms. Cruelly, fate had one last irony in store. In 1898, Vicky was diagnosed with breast cancer. She died a slow, agonizing death, mirroring the suffering of her husband. She died in August 1901, just months after her mother, Queen Victoria. With her death, the last direct link to the liberal dream was severed. Let us indulge for a moment in the what if. Let us imagine that Dr. Mackenzie was right, or that the surgery in 1887 was successful. Let us imagine Frederick III reigned until 1910 or 1920. Germany in 1910 under Frederick III would have looked very different. The Reichstag would have become a true parliament with ministers responsible to the people, not the Kaiser. The Social Democrats, the largest party in Germany, would have been integrated into the government as partners in reform rather than treated as enemies of the Reich. This would have defused the class tensions that later tore the Weimar Republic apart. Externally, there would be no triple entente encircling Germany. The Central Powers would likely be loosely aligned with Britain. France, isolated, would not have dared to seek revenge for 1870. The Balkans might still have been a powder keg, but with a calm, sensible emperor in Berlin, one who abhorred war, the crisis in Sarajevo in 1914 would likely have been managed diplomatically. There would have been no blank check given to Austria to attack Serbia. There would have been no invasion of Belgium. There would have been no Battle of the Somme, no Verdun, no Lenin sent to Russia on a sealed train. The Russian Revolution might never have happened, or would have taken a constitutional path. The Nazi Party would have remained the fever dream of a failed artist in Vienna, with no devastated, humiliated Germany to host its virus. The 20th century could have been a century of evolution, not revolution, a century of peace. But history is not written in ifs. It is written in the cold, hard facts of biology. The cancer cell that mutated in the larynx of the Crown Prince sometime in 1886 was the ultimate butterfly effect. That microscopic rebellion of tissue set off a chain reaction that toppled empires. Because Frederick died, Wilhelm ruled. Because Wilhelm ruled, Bismarck was fired. Because Bismarck was fired, the alliance with Russia ended. Because the alliance ended, Russia allied with France. Because Wilhelm built a navy, Britain allied with France and Russia. Because the alliances were locked, the assassination of an archduke in 1914 dragged the whole world into the abyss. And from the ashes of that war rose Hitler, Stalin, and the second, even greater apocalypse of 1939. In the end, the story of Frederick III is a haunting reminder of the fragility of civilization. We build institutions, we write constitutions, we form armies, but ultimately, the fate of nations often rests on the physical health of a single individual. Frederick III was the right man at the right time, but he ran out of time. His 99-day reign was a flicker of light in a darkening room. He is the lost emperor, the man who took the secret of a better world with him into the grave. Today, if you visit the Friedenskirche in Potsdam, you can see his tomb. He lies next to his beloved Vicky. The marble effigy depicts him asleep, peaceful, his suffering over. But if you listen closely in the silence of that crypt, you can hear the echo of the 20th century, the roar of the guns, the screams of the dying, and the weeping of a world that lost its way because a good man lost his voice.